Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today we are going to talk about the fact that Mars is about to turn direct. We've had Mars retrograde since September, and this retrograde has been in the sign of Aries, and now Mars is finally stationing and will turn direct over the weekend, just as we also have a new moon coming through in the sign of Scorpio. So we'll talk a little bit about the new moon in Scorpio, but really we'll be focused a lot on this new moon in Scorpio, given the context of the new moon in Scorpio's ruler, Mars, turning direct. So that's what we'll do today. Now, before we get into it, I just want to remind everybody that my new class, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, starts tomorrow. So you have one day left to take advantage of the early bird rate, which you can save a little bit of money when you do that. And also, there's payment plans and need-based tuition. You guys have heard me talk about this a lot by now. I'm really excited to begin a new class. Check it out on my website, nightlightastrology.com. If you got any questions, last minute questions, you can email me at info@nightlightastrology.com. We also try to make sure that nobody's priced out. So we do have need-based tuition for people who are struggling. If you fit that criteria, feel free to apply. We always try to make that possible for people. So all right. Now, one thing that I want to do before we dive into interpreting this is give you a little outline of how I'm going to talk about this. You can kind of anticipate what's coming. We're going to go through the progression of Mars in Aries since it entered Aries this past summer and just kind of map out all of the stages of it and where it is now and what it still has left to go, because even though it's turning direct, it's still got to work its way through the rest of Aries. So we'll work our way through that whole progression with the real-time clock. We're going to talk about some of the main themes that we have probably witnessed or experienced in our personal lives while Mars has been retrograde, and then what to expect as Mars turns direct and covers all of the degrees that it's already covered between now and the new year. We're going to go through each rising sign to talk about what you might have experienced or what you might continue to experience given Mars turning direct in each of the whole sign houses based on your rising sign. So that's what we're doing today. All right, let's dive in. So you can see right here in the real-time clock that we have the new moon is forming in the sign of Scorpio. So you can see that right there. And this is going to happen late Saturday night into Sunday here in the Midwest anyway. But it's you can imagine this as a Saturday, Sunday kind of deal. A new moon in Scorpio means a Mars-ruled lunar cycle to come. But the good news is that this Mars-ruled lunar cycle to come happens as Venus is overcoming a stellium from Libra to Capricorn, and as Mars gains a whole lot of dignity back, which means that we should start seeing a much more effective Mars, a Mars that's able to act, but also achieve results through a harmonization of forces around us. So it's a Mars that's in a lot better shape. Another aspect that we'll be looking at next week that's going to be a big deal is Mercury's opposition to Uranus. There is going to be some more explosive qualities to this Mars as it's turning direct that'll coincide with that Mercury opposite Uranus. We'll talk about that next week. For now, let's go back in time and take a look at where Mars has been. So I'm going to bring you back to June, basically, and let's take a look. Here's Mars in Pisces and switches into Aries right around the very end of June. So we're on the 28th right now, and you can see Mars entering Aries. Now, Mars is then going to trudge along through the sign of Aries, and it reaches the degree range of the retrograde by late July. You're thinking about July 25th, right around there, Mars enters the 15th degree of Aries. So one of the things that's really helpful when you're looking at a retrograde is to look at the total degree space that it covers. It's stationing right now at about 15 degrees of Aries. So we want to see, well, when did Mars first cross 15 Aries, which is effectively, you could say, sort of, sometimes people call it its shadow period. But once it starts going across the degrees that it will cover later through retrograde, you want to pay attention because all of that time is going to be included in the meaning of the retrograde and the cycle as a whole. So think about late July. Now, I'm going to give you my story of this as we go, just so that you can have a model for how to track your own story. So, for example, in late July, we were deciding that we were going to leave Maryland and move to the Twin Cities, which is back home for me. So we made that choice about late July. All right. So that's the bookend for me, right? And that's when right about that time is when we put our house, we decided to put our house on the market in Maryland, right? We're going to sell our house. So, okay, so there you go. That's July 25th. So track that out. Even sit down with a journal. It'll really help you to, this exercise is really helpful to get the most out of a retrograde period, especially a long one like Mars retrograde. All right, so if we take this forward from, say, late July, we're going to see Mars then cover a lot of ground going through August until we get into September. And once we get into September, then you're going to see Mars really slowing down the late degrees of Aries. And here you can see Mars stationing about 28 degrees of Aries. And this is around September 10th. So if we take this a day forward, we see that between the 10th and the 11th, Mars turns retrograde. Okay, so now from the 10th to the 11th, what you're thinking about is a period of retrogradation that will last from about that time up until now. So you're talking about September 11th to roughly middle of November. So that's about 2 months. A long time that we've had Mars retrograde, right? Okay, so now what you're thinking about at the current moment is here's Mars going to go back over all of the degrees that it went over from late July, and between mid-September through mid-November, it's going to go back over all of those degrees by retrograde. It's sort of like cross-examination. You're putting one thing forward, but then you're calling up a witness, and the witness is going to offer a testimony that either supports what Mars did in the first period or offers something in contrast to what Mars did. So, a witness that comes up is either going to be a corroborating witness, or the witness might offer testimony that conflicts with the testimony that's already been offered. So that's what a retrograde period is like. It's one of the ways that ancient astrologers thought about retrogrades is that, again, like whatever the planet brings forth as an omen, as a symbol, as a proclamation of the God's will in our lives, will then be called back into question and either further deepened and corroborated or potentially challenged or reversed. So retrogrades are not a one-size-fits-all phenomenon, right? You can have things that happen during a retrograde that really reverse things that went before it, or it can be a process of deepening and refining something that came before it, which is why you'll sometimes hear people refer to retrogrades as periods of revision. Oftentimes there is a kind of breakdown. When we refine something, like if you think about writing a book, you refine it, you will kind of tear it apart a little bit. There was a phrase I remember in my MFA program in creative writing where, I think it came from Faulkner. It was you have to be willing to kill your darlings, strike lines or paragraphs that you love from your manuscripts, from your book. This period you could think of like that too, where it's been a process of refining intentions, refining actions, and refining motivations, all things that Mars is related to as the retrograde has taken place. It doesn't necessarily have to be, oh, well, everything got messed up or everything got reversed or canceled. Now, there can be elements of that during a retrograde where things that have been put forth are called back into question and reversed or overturned or sort of eliminated or zeroed out or something like that. And sometimes a combination of both. Some things that don't work, some things that do. Oftentimes retrogrades mean delays. Remember that a retrograde is a picture of a planet that is normally cutting against the grain of the primary motion of the sky, the Earth's rotation on its axis, which carries planets from the east to the west, and it's moving against that grain from west toward the east. Well, when a retrograde comes, suddenly the planet falls back into the primary motion, and it appears as though it's moving along with it. And I've always thought of that as a picture of the larger hand of fate, as a kind of a period of divine intervention. Each planet has agency, just like every soul has agency. And yet there are times where destiny, the gods, the will of the divine, just take over in our lives, and we are faced with the limitations of our own power. And in a sense, the gods are too. The gods, or at least the gods, resemble that loss of autonomy or agency during retrograde periods where something bigger takes over. They have to fall in line with something larger than themselves. And there can be a lot of learning and growth in that, and challenges to our integrity. Are we able to surrender to periods of frustration with when it comes to our will? That's a question for a Mars retrograde. Are we able to go along with the revisions that come along, even though they delay us or set us back in some way, or offer us feedback or even constructive criticism about the way we're living our lives? Those are periods that, if people can answer those questions with a little bit of courage and excitement, retrograde periods can be very fruitful because they really help us grow and mature, especially with Mars, because Mars has a lot to do with our willpower and our sense of strength or potency in the world. If we buy into the myth that I am the measure of all things and I determine all things and I'm in control of all things, I create my own reality, the future is wide open, it's all possibility, I'm in control of the world. If those are our mantras, Mars retrograde periods can be very frustrating because it turns out that we have some control, we have some agency, but we're also a part of the body of God, of the universe, of forces that are much larger than ourselves. And we have to learn how to cooperate and serve that larger whole. Mars periods can teach us how to relinquish our will. Remember that Mars, and I mentioned this over the summer when we were prepping for this transit, Mars is the planet that is related to martyrs. Now, a martyr is someone who may die for a cause, something that's bigger than themselves. And sometimes people do so, they develop a martyr complex. So they try to gain esteem or love or praise or worth or valor by falling on their own sword, and it's very dramatic and it's actually serving the ego. But the other version of it is that, I can't think of one, really elevated saintly personality in the world who hasn't been an emblem of service to humanity or service to others or service to the soul or service to God, however you want to think about it. So Mars retrograde periods can teach us how to serve something other than our own will and how to surrender to forces, the assertion of other energies or forces around us that we may feel like we want to compete with or lock horns with or whatever. But, my experience with Mars retrogrades is that if you learn how to become, if you adjust to being a soldier for the right causes, and if you relinquish your control and your will, then these become these amazing periods of refinement where you have integrity, your will becomes more intelligent, you understand the proper use of your energy and resources, putting them into the service of things bigger than yourself. That's the true meaning of a warrior in the spiritual sense. So Mars the martyr, Mars the one who will sacrifice themselves to something larger. Don't forget that it was the 6th house that was called the joy of Mars, and it was associated with military service as well as any kinds of thankless labor or sacrifice, sometimes slavery as well. So you think about what we are enslaved to in the world and what we serve relentlessly. Most of it is our selfish interest. We're actually one of the most basic ways in which we can understand the idea of slavery, aside from its literal incarnations in the world, would be the way in which that we all fall prey to our own selfish interests. We become slave to them, and it's a thankless taskmaster. The 6th house is a house that was traditionally associated with enemies and conflict and battle, but also a sense of sacrifice and a sense of service. So that's all Mars stuff, right? Why would Mars be the god associated with service? Because the only way that one becomes an effective servant is to realize the appropriate use of the will. When we think the will is in service to ourselves, then we become enemies of others, and others become our enemies, because we end up caught in a life that's all about competing resources, aggression, conflict, competition for the objects of our desire. Whereas when we come into service, we get the relief of setting aside our own selfish interests. We get the relief of setting aside the burden of our own ego. And we get the relief of saying, no, I'm not, it's not about me. I serve something. I serve love. I serve peace. I serve truth. And we can be very strong, but in a way that takes our own ego and selfish interest out of the equation. And who knew what a relief that was, right? So Mars retrograde periods can be very, they seem scary because like Mercury retrograde, we get them a couple times. You get them like 3 times a year. Sometimes I think we might get them 4 times a year sometimes, but you get them enough and you go like, okay, everything's going to go kind of wonky and, unpredictable, erratic delays. I'm going to have to go to the iPhone store or the Apple store or whatever. And I'm going to have to, like we're used to the like inconveniences of a retrograde, especially with Mercury, but we rarely talk about the opportunity of retrogrades, especially the Venus and Mars retrogrades. We had a big Venus retrograde this year. Now we had this long Mars retrograde. What did we learn? So again, now if I track my own story and kind of trace this out, and I'm going to go into this more when I actually go through house by house. But, I had a lot of things happen between that late July and up till right now that basically were examples of how little I am in control, especially with my family members, because I had a lot of more challenging things happen with the health and situations of family members, but also the process of selling our house. So I'll tell you guys that story when I pull open, and I go through all the rising signs, but it was, I like, obviously I fancy myself a humble and devoted servant, right? Because I'm on the path of bhakti yoga, but man, the layers of selfishness are just so deep, and it's, it's interesting to see. And I'm really grateful for what I was able to learn about, how frustrated I can get when things don't go my way, real Mars retrograde theme and others. Anyway, I'll come back to that later. So Mars retrograde, what else can it provide? Well, now that you have this picture, right, let's go forward in time and just talk about what's going to happen. You can see Mars is at about 15 degrees of Aries in the chart that I've got up right now. Now, if we take this forward day at a time, you're going to see that Mars will gradually work its way back to that 28th degree. So we have one more period. And I think about this cheesy, cheap word, but it's true, integration. Integrating the things that we've learned, or hopefully integration only happens if we have been, willing and what do I want to say? Reflective participants, then this period is typically one of integration of lessons learned, and of the progress that's made because of the lessons that we've learned. There's going to be a big moment of catharsis when Mars squares Pluto. This is right on the winter solstice, just as Jupiter and Saturn conjoin in the early degrees of Aquarius. We will definitely be visiting that one in December. So that's another great moment of catharsis. And if we're in the process of integration because we've been reflective participants, this will be a very big turning point for us. A lot of the times, the way that you can tell that we haven't been as reflective as maybe we could be is that when these transits happen, it constantly feels like things are happening to us. And we kind of flail around and react and get really overwhelmed. And we often react and make choices out of frustration. And that has this domino effect that can be really disastrous. It can, maybe not disastrous, but it can be, we can add, what's the word? Add misery to suffering or something like that. We can, in other words, we can kind of, we can make our dilemma much more difficult by reacting to it in ways that are only reflective of the fact that we really weren't getting the message. That is, whereas I see people frequently in my practice who are getting the message that in such moments, choices are made that are reflective of the maturing that's been done. And you're going to have a moment for that that's really profound right around the winter solstice this year. I feel like the last time that I anticipated a winter solstice so much was, back in 2012 when it was like the end of the Mayan calendar, this major, this kind of astrological omen of great significance on the winter solstice, of course, summer solstice if you're in the Southern hemisphere, but it feels like that again, just in the sense of there being this really transformational moment happening on that date. And I'm not at all making allusions to the end of the world or anything like that. I'm just saying it just has a similar feeling of heaviness. Significance. All right, so if you go forward from there, Mars is going to break free from late Aries and where it's stationed right around the first couple of days of the new year, and finally enters Taurus between January 6th and 7th. And as it does so, it will then move right immediately into a square with Saturn and Jupiter and a conjunction with Uranus. That's another major Mars dynamic that's happening. And so Mars doesn't really get clear of the super intense transit lines until, like, let's just give it, yeah, I would say like late January, right? That's about, you can see right at late January, here's Mars at 10 degrees of Taurus, just separating right from the square to Jupiter. And so, it's a long, there's a long stretch of Mars going forward and then hitting all of these aspects. Well, that's when you think about the implementation of things learned, that there's a shift in momentum now, and the cross-examination period of the retrograde is over. So what happens next? Well, either we see momentum and new actions based on insights, lessons learned during the retrograde period, or we see continuation of challenges and struggles. And I can always, like, I know it sounds, I don't want to sound judgmental, but it's like in my practice and in my own life, what I've seen over many years of doing this is that when you see a turning point like this after a retrograde followed by a bunch of heavy aspects, you get one of two scenarios. One, a person is implementing the lessons and insights gained through the hard inner work that's been done during the retrograde, or two, if they didn't get the message, they will get it on the way out as the retrograde separates, and oftentimes in a much more difficult way. That's just what I've noticed. Anyway, so it's quite a path for Mars ahead. We'll be tracking all of that out, transit by transit in December and even into January. All right, so here are just basically, I want to talk about some themes to watch for during, what kinds of themes would have come up during a Mars retrograde. Mars is action. So you're thinking about, as Mars turns direct, you're thinking about an ability to take an action that has perhaps been frustrated or slowed down or delayed, or prohibited in some way. You can think about desires or motivations changing during this period, and now as they've reoriented, starting to establish some momentum and some forward movement and some actions that can be taken. So as our motivations and desires change, then the course of action changes. And that's what we're seeing right now, is a kind of change of motivation, change of desire, turns direct, actions based on new motivations or intentions or desires. Anger or frustration, if those have been themes and you've been working on those themes, you may start to feel a sense of relief as you are leveling up a little bit when it comes to impulse or temper or anger or frustration. And if not, if you've just been really if you've been peeling out this whole time during the Mars retrograde with anger and frustration, I would say, do the work now, because there's a bunch of aspects coming up, as I just said, that will not be easy for someone who's just been banging their head against the wall the whole time. So anyone that's like resisting right now, the natural course that things are trying to take, that the natural course that is trying to unfold, will find real frustration and, even, embarrassment or humiliation, or really consequential levels of conflict that could be avoided if we, through this retrograde period, sort of took a moment to realize, well, this is what it is, and I have to accept it for what it is. Let's see, determination, conflict, and hostility. You can think about, if you've been really determined about something and sticking with something and riding out different conflicts or hostilities or frustrations of will or resources or energy, this turning point will start to help you move forward again. You'll feel like, okay, it's sort of like if you've been in you're in a long workout, the turning direct is like starting to have that runner's breakthrough where the labor of it turns into bliss. You're like, oh, now this feels really good. I'm hitting that runner's high. Kind of Mars turning direct again after a period of frustration and having to persevere and remain determined and so forth. also, you know, I can't tell you how many clients just on a very practical level have undergone some kind of major physical or dietary or you know, transformation where there's a new workout regimen or something very Mars-like that they've been taking on. And you know, when you see this turning point come, it's often a sign that people are starting to reach goals that they've been working on, and that they've had to refine their will, their effort, their determination. You've had to call up courage to work through something, and now it's being rewarded. You're hitting a breakthrough. It's like now you're off and running. So those are some basic things that I would think about as defining this turn of Mars into direct motion. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to take Mars through all 12 of the whole sign houses by rising sign so that you can get a sense of what kind of themes you might have been noticing or experiencing as this Mars retrograde transit has happened, and therefore, you know, what you may notice going forward as Mars continues to make its way through Aries until the new year. All right, so I'm going to put this up on the screen, and we're just going to go through some of the topics pretty quickly here to give you a refresh. And this is something we did in the summer, but it's good to go back over it right now. So let's say that you've had Mars and Aries in your first house. You're an Aries rising. Then we're using whole sign houses here. So we're assuming you're an Aries rising with, you know, Mars in your first whole sign house. If that's you, then we're talking about your personality, your energy, your physical vitality. This is probably one of the most common ones that I would see for people dealing literally with psychological themes like anger or frustration or going through a diet or physical exercise, you know, regiment of some kind, because the first house is very physical. It has a lot to do with our vital energy. It is also connected to our character and our behavior in the world, though. So this is your ruling planet. You're thinking about a period of maturation and growth and how you relate to that Mars principle, which has a big impact on, you know, your psyche and how you relate to others in the world. Now, if we go forward and we're going to put Taurus into the first house. Now, this one's mine. I can tell you about this one because I'm a Taurus rising. So Mars in the 12th house. Well, like late July, right? All the way up until now, we've been trying to sell the house. We went through several contracts that were dropped. And the reason for that was because we have a really old house, like 100+ years old. And the people who were wanting to buy it were military loan. They had military loans. Isn't that interesting, Mars? This is square, by the way, to my sun and moon, this Mars transit. And sun happens to be the ruler of my fourth house of home, family, property, etc. Moon is also related to the similar themes, right? So it's been very personal for me. And we had a bunch of loans fall through from military people. We had someone break into our house. My mom and her partner got COVID. My sister got into a car accident, and then they had to do an emergency C-section. You know, and my dad had heart problems. That was like, and so many of those things were completely out of my control. And then, you know, wait on the house. Well, as Mars turns direct today and into this weekend, we should be finalizing and getting ready to close by next week on the house, finally. And to someone still in the military, but they got a different type of loan that was able to go through. Isn't that amazing, right? And my mom, as this is stationing and turning direct in a square to my natal moon, my mom is recovering. Her partner just got home from the hospital. My sister just went home from the hospital with the baby. So you see there's a lot of turnarounds. And what did I learn during that period? 12th house. Well, the 12th house is a liminal space. It's filled with a lot of suffering, frankly, but it's filled with the kind of suffering that gives you that sense of, hey, I'm not in control. In fact, that was one of the main things that really defined the 12th house in ancient astrology, was this sense of not being in control of yourself, or not being in control of a situation, or being sort of lost or overwhelmed, not having the wheel of the ship. That's one of the things that defines the 12th. So if you're a Taurus rising, you've been going through it like I have, I feel you. Anyway, but the 12th house, also the labor pains, women in childbirth that come before birth. So with Mars turning direct, there's gestation and there's birth ahead. And it's going to take until about the new year. All right. Now let's push into Gemini rising. If you're a Gemini rising, this Mars action has taken place in your 11th house of friends, groups, maybe colleagues or professional organizations, your social life. And so you may have noticed that there's been some significant changes in those areas. Not unusual to see conflicts and then conflicts resolved, conflicts that change your priorities or your values, conflicts within organizations or professional groups that you belong to, as well as delays or just general challenges that you've been through that are now hopefully turning the corner, and hopefully you'll see some improvement if you've been dealing with challenges in those areas. We can also, if you're a Cancer rising, let's put Cancer on the ascendant, you can also look at Mars up here in the 10th house, see some similar themes to the 11th. Potential conflicts in the workplace or initiatives or projects or actions that you're trying to take at work, things that you're trying to do professionally, and maybe some delays or setbacks. My wife is a Cancer rising, and during this period of time when we moved, she was out of childcare and without childcare, due partly to COVID and partly to moving, and is finally just getting childcare in place again and sort of picking up her own, rhythm and routine with her work. Very common to see Mars in the 10th house retrograde, referring to significant changes around the pace or style of your work environment or leadership in the work environment, or other kinds of changes that are frustrating or kind of out of your control. Well, Mars turning direct should mean that a period of frustration or breakdown and refinement and so forth is now ready for some kind of implementation and more constructive level of change. Now, we're going to move this forward to put Leo on the ascendant. Putting Leo on the ascendant, we move Mars into the 9th house. So the 9th house is a place that's related to our faith, our beliefs, learning and higher education, teachers. It's associated with the law, and it's also associated with foreign countries and long journeys. So for Leo risings, if you have been going through a period of examining your beliefs, your convictions, Mars in the 9th is very much a Joan of Arc placement. It's about the vision that inspires us. It's about the call to to action. It energizes us through our beliefs, through learning and teaching, or through expanding our horizons abroad. And if you've been experiencing different kinds of challenges, breakdowns, delays, frustration in this area, expect that lessons will be learned and that implementation of refined beliefs and understanding about yourself and the world will start to take shape. I really like that one for Leos. I'd love to hear some of you Leos out there. I'd really love to hear your stories about it, because I have some friends with Leo rising. I've been thinking about this one a lot lately. Anyway, let's go into Virgo rising. So this places Mars in the 8th house if you're a Virgo rising. 8th house is, of course, related to debts and obligations that we have to other people, the value and esteem of other people, their resources and money, as well as death, uncertainty about the future, fear and anxiety. It's a house that has a lot to do with the entrance into the underworld, and we can't bring anything with us down there, right? So this could have been a period of time, if you're a Virgo rising, where different things are stripped back or taken away, or you're coming into contact with the reality of death in some way. My daughter, who is almost 5 years old, is a Virgo rising, and as my mom was really sick with COVID, and my mom's partner, Jeff, who is very dear to our family as well, and my daughter knows very well, was in the hospital in the ICU, almost on a ventilator. She was really, for the first time in her life, grappling with death. This was a huge feature of the culmination of this retrograde period. But it actually started back when we showed her a movie called Coco, which I don't know if you guys have seen or not before. It's a really great Disney movie. I think it's Disney. And it's about a celebration of the Day of the Dead, and in Mexico, I believe. And there's a lot of the themes of death, dying, and the dead are in that movie. And between that and Halloween and grandma and her partner in the hospital, this was a very interesting time for watching my daughter become aware of death. So I'm just saying, even for a 5-year-old, you could have some of those themes come up. But otherwise, obligations or debts to other people, or clearing debts, that you have to other people and things like that could be a big part of it. Conflicts over money and resources in relationships could also be a part of it. As always, with all of these, I'd love to hear you guys' stories and hear what you've been going through. If you're a Libra rising, it's been straight up about relationships, right? Relationships, intimacy, the social dimension of your life, sexuality. So Mars there has been providing, different kinds of conflict and frustrations and challenges, but also refinement. Sometimes the Mars in the seventh house for a Libra in particular will call for greater, what do I want to say? Libras are often people of Venus, right? So if you're a Venusian person, your natural way of thinking about yourself is in relationship, in relating to others and to the world. The Mars energy in the seventh, the Mars retrograde, could be about people in your life who have been not as interested in harmonizing, or have been holding up a mirror for you and saying, hey, look, you need to learn how to assert your own will, regardless of if it's always pleasing to others. So you see that Mars-Venus theme coming up pretty strongly when it's in the seventh house for Venus, or but if it was Scorpio and Taurus was rising, it would be similar, but yeah. All right, anyway, let's put Scorpio on the ascendant. If you're a Scorpio rising, Mars has been in the sixth house. You're thinking about laboring through something that involves a lot of work, sacrifice, etc. One of my close friends is a Scorpio rising, and their work environment changed significantly during this period because new management took over. And as new management took over, the expectations around what they do and what their daily work life looks like changed radically during this time. There's been actually a lot of conflict from the staff that basically the company was bought out. So this new management came in, and the staff has been really pissed off because they suddenly feel like they're not being treated like people. How does that sound for the sixth house, right? But the sixth house, service, sickness, disease, accidents, as well as perseverance, some form of selfless sacrifice. These have been the themes of your Mars retrograde. And you will start enjoying the results of hard work done between now and the end of the year, I think, if you're a Scorpio rising. So way to soldier through. All right, let's put Sagittarius on the ascendant. Here we're putting Mars in the fifth house, and we're talking about the house of pleasure, recreation, joy, pregnancy is related to sex and romance, but also creativity, children. So the fifth house is called the joy of Venus and the house of good fortune. Mars retrograde in this house is interesting because again, usually any kind of like Mars or Saturn transit in this house will have something to do with whether our desires are getting the best of us, or if we, like with Saturn, it's almost always like, am I allowing myself to have fun, or am I being too conservative somehow? With Mars, it's sometimes, am I going to an extreme? Am I being reckless or indulgent? And do I need to pull back? Am I getting feedback that I'm being excessive in some way? For example, Mars in the fifth retrograde could be the mistakes of a gambler, or the mistakes of someone who spends too much money on alcohol, or, kind of frivolous things. On the other hand, this can be a great, what do I want to say? Like, Mars retrograde can provide feedback for someone in terms of how you express yourself in the world creatively. Are you strong enough? Are you overpowering or overbearing? Some of those things can come up during Mars retrograde in the fifth. I'd like to hear your stories on that one as well. I'd be really curious to hear more about that one. One thing that I will say, I do actually have one client that comes to mind who's had this in the fifth house, and they have been unable to do their normal cycling. They're a cyclist, and they've been unable to cycle because of an injury. Mars retrograde in the fifth house sometimes prohibits you from doing the things that really bring you joy. In this case, an athletic thing. Just a simple example, but that's a fitting one. All right, so if you put Capricorn on the ascendant, we're pushing Mars into the fourth house. Its retrograde period has had an impact on home, family, parents, property, land, your roots, and your foundation. Big family karma transit. And oftentimes Mars will bring up, the kind of civil war vibe in the fourth house, or conflicts, in other words, among family members, or also establishing something new. Mars is very inceptional. Mars likes to start things and initiate things. What kinds of actions have you tried to initiate around home, family, etc.? I have a friend, for example, Capricorn rising, who moved during this retrograde period. And I have a client with Capricorn rising who is in the process of renovation, but got held up during this retrograde period due to some kinds of county bureaucratic, what is it called? Permitting. They needed certain permitting and they weren't able to get it and they had to wait. And it looks like I would more than from what I've heard and what I think about this transit, my guess would be that they would be on their way by the time that this Mars energy finishes up in the 4th house, because it wasn't, you can't do this. It was, there's some big delay and a huge process you have to go through. If any of you guys have ever done permitting before for any kind of business or anything, you guys know what I'm talking about. It can be a real pain in the butt. Anyway, okay, let's put Aquarius on the ascendant and put Mars in the 3rd house, place of siblings, neighborhood, environment. And so not uncommon to see more mental turbulence when Mars is in the 3rd house. This is a place that's associated with the mind and the fluctuations of the mind and the immediate environment. Loosely connected to that would be the topic of siblings or people that are somehow familiar to you in your immediate environment or share some kind of common root system with you. That's why the 3rd house is called the joy of the moon, and it's connected with like folk, almost like folk customs or folk traditions. But one of the things that I've noticed the most is I have a family member, for example, who has Aquarius rising. And one of the things that they've gone through during this period has been a lot of mental, emotional turmoil. And don't remember the 3rd house called the joy of the moon. And the moon was related both to the mind and to the kind of emotional responses that we have based on what's flowing through our mind. And that's why it's also connected to the immediate environment, which is a kind of mirror of the mind, or it has such an influence on the mind. It's very closely linked. So it's not unusual to see more like mental perturbations, is that the word, in the immediate sphere of activity when Mars is retrograde in the 3rd house. Can affect things like travel and cars and breakdowns with automobiles or even technology or some kind of change of technology. It can also have to do with learning to speak or communicate more directly versus, or questions about what is the healthy way of expressing strength or assertiveness or Mars qualities through our communication versus what is unhealthy. So those are some of the things that have probably come up for you if you have Mars in the 3rd during this retrograde that make you an Aquarius rising. All right. Last but not least is Pisces. You put Pisces on the ascendant and Mars has been retrograde in your 2nd house. Money, resources, energy, whether it's your time, it's what you have and how you use it, or it's what you're building or what you consume, what you have and hold. It also has something to do, sometimes people say it has something to do with your values. That's not really true. It has more to do with your sense of self-esteem based on what you have or what you possess. I possess this skill, this talent, I possess this money, I possess these assets. It's the things that we have that sort of adorn us and make us feel worthwhile in that sense. But it's not the same as what we value in terms of ideas or beliefs that motivate action in the world in a spiritual or philosophical or even ethical sense. So people make that mistake a lot by thinking the 2nd house reflects your values. No, it really doesn't. The 1st house, possibly the 9th house, some certain planetary positions in the chart usually will tell you more. Like the 1st house was related to Dharma by Indian astrologers. That has more to do with your core values that motivate the whole of your life. The 2nd house would be more like, I have a degree on my wall and it gives me a sense of esteem, or, it's almost more like the adornments, the accolades, the things that we sort of have that add some sense of value to our lives. There's a reason that, this house is associated, for example, with things that we plant in a garden that will come up and, kind of provide us with potentially like a bountiful harvest. But in that sense, it's also related to fleeting material things. And this is why the house is also called the idle place and the gate of Hades. More on that in maybe a different talk sometime. But all I'm saying is that the 2nd house, Mars retrograde, would have something to do with the assets or resources or or things that you have or possess, whether they're more intangible, like a skill or an ability, or something that you've actually made or produced from your own efforts. It can also refer to business or entrepreneurial endeavors, things that you make or sell or build or profit from. It's also related to expenses, expenditures, things that are taken away from you potentially. And that's also ties into the eighth house opposition a little bit too. But so this is where the action has been for you if you're a Pisces rising. Anyway, that takes us through the whole 12 signs. I'd love to hear all of your stories and hear how it's been going for you. With this new moon in Scorpio, remember, we're planting a new seed, new beginning. Look at that whole sign house of Scorpio in your chart, connect it to the house of Mars if you want to do that to get a sense of what the next new moon cycle is going to involve on a more detailed level. We'll be taking a look at this, all of those transits from Mars that are coming up that take us into January. So there's a lot more Mars energy to come between now and the new year. It ends, by the way, all of that culminates with a Mars conjunction to Uranus, which, among other things, although it can be a very erratic and destabilizing energy, also represents freedom, a sense of breaking through, having a major moment of breakthrough. So, one last time, thank you guys for listening today. My new class, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, starts tomorrow. There's 1 day left. You can still take advantage of the early bird rate and save $500 off. There's payment plan if you need it. There's need-based tuition if you're in need. Try to make sure that nobody's ever priced out. Really looking forward to starting up a new unit and studying with a new group of people. Lots of good, lots of good things to study over, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere. The winter months of studying are my favorite. Like it is my absolute favorite time of year to kind of, cozy up in the evenings after the kids are in bed and just, read ancient astrology texts and look at charts and things like that. And I really enjoy studying with people over these particular months. Anyway, thank you guys for listening. I hope you have a really great weekend, and we will see you again next week.